None of the Shah's comments raised hackles like his blast at the American Jewish lobby. Its influence, he claimed, went all the way to the top.
Surely, Your Majesty, you're not telling me that the Jewish lobby in the United States pulls the strings of the presidency?
Not entirely, but I think even a little too much, even for Israel interests.
You think the Jewish lobby in the United States is too powerful for the interests of Israel?
I think so. Sometimes they are disserving the interests of Israel because they're pushing around too many people.
Why would the President of the United States pay attention to that lobby?
They are strong.
Strong in what sense?
They are controlling many things.
Controlling what?
Newspapers, medias,
Your Majesty.
banks, finances, and I'm going to stop there.
Well, now wait just a second. You really do believe that the Jewish community in the United States is that powerful? They make the media reflect their view of foreign policy?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
They do not report, we do not report honestly?
Don't mix things, please. I don't say the media. I say in the media they have people. Not the entire media. Some newspapers will only reflect their views, yes.
No. The New York Times, for instance, is owned by the Salzburger family, who are Jewish. Are you suggesting that the New York Times is biased in its treatment of the question of Zionism, Israel's existence, the United States' relationship with the Arab world?
I will have to put all the articles of the New York Times written on this subject and draw the conclusion. You can put this to the computer and it will answer you.
What you're saying is that, yes, you do believe.
Well, let's wait for the answer of the computer.
Washington Post?
The same.
The networks?
Less.
I must say you are speaking with your characteristic candor.
Yes, if you like. I try to be candid. I have always been.
Talk about American strategy towards Iran. It's fairly well known. You had a bit of a falling out with President Obama on this. You were talking about opposing any potential Israeli attack on Iran. I mean, you weren't the only one.
No, I wasn't saying opposing. I was saying that we should not let them use our airspace without our permission, because no matter what, we would be held as complicit and we would be paying the price for it. So if our view is that this is not desirable, we should not allow our airspace to be used. If we want it to be used, fine, but let's be clear about it. It's not a good idea to stumble into a war regarding which you're ambivalent. That has to be made, that decision has to be made with open eyes. But my view on Iran is that we have to be patient and that deterrence can work. We don't need to increase the scale of the conflict in the region that we have been discussing, because an increase in that conflict involving the Iranians in a collision with us would make our task in Afghanistan absolutely impossible, would probably reignite the conflict in Iraq, would set the Persian Gulf ablaze, would increase the price of oil twofold, threefold, fourfold, and Americans would be paying $5, $6 a gallon at the gas stations. Europe would become even more dependent on the Soviet Union for energy. So what is the benefit to us?
The people advocating this more militaristic approach, I have to ask, do you think they mean it, or is this good cop, bad cop?
I'm not a mind reader.
It seems the Pandora's box this would open boggles the mind.
That's, I would think any reasonable person would conclude that. And I think the United States is not in favor of a war. And that's why we're doing what we can in Geneva.
Is Israel serious in these threats?
I have no idea. I have no idea. All I know is, as an analyst of international politics, that this will be a disaster. And frankly, I think it'll be a disaster for us more than for Israel. More than for Israel in the short run, and a fundamental disaster for Israel in the long run. Because if the consequence of that is that in the end we're forced out of the region, as we might be, because of almost sort of dynamic hatred that develops, and have no illusions about it, that conflict spreads, we're going to be alone. The Russians are not going to be with us. They're not suckers. The Europeans are not going to be with us. They don't like to be in the forefront of conflict for historic reasons. We are going to be engaged. And if we are finally driven out, how much would you bet on the survival of Israel for more than 5 to 10 years after all that has happened? So, you know, some people who criticize me for being straightforward on this think this is an anti-Israeli point of view. You know, they're entitled to their demagogy. But my view is it will be a geopolitical disaster for us in the short run, and it's to the extent that Israelis are concerned about it for themselves.
The pressure that's being put on Iran is pushing Iran closer to Russia and China.
No, it's not pushing them close to Russia or China. We're pushing the Chinese and the Russians to engage in a more direct conflict with the Iranians, but they're reluctant because they have a different view of the situation. And in a different way, each has different interests.
But Russia and China are both getting much more involved in the Iranian economy. Iran comes to the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement meetings.
No, wait a second. The Chinese are getting more involved in Iranian economy because they need energy. And they're not going to be particularly grateful if we produce a conflict in the region. And that will also affect them. And what consequences that might have for the world economy is hard to predict. All I'm saying is, don't try to follow this silly notion, oh, we'll just bomb them, and the problem is solved. It's a false analogy, and historically, there's one fundamental lesson we shouldn't forget. Stalin and the Soviet Union was more of a threat than Iran ever will be, and yet we deterred it. Mao Zedong talked of a nuclear war which might kill 300 million people, and so what? And we didn't have a war with the Chinese. Why should we act like crazies in dealing with Iran?
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.
Well, let's see the evidence that they provide. So far, they've not been able to provide any evidence. But I would say this, anyone reading the press reports on these contingency plans being drawn up by the Ministry of Defence here in London for an attack on Iran must be worrying that if Iran is not developing a nuclear missile, it will now be developing a nuclear missile, faced with the idea that the Americans, the British and the Israelis are looking to launch an unprovoked attack on Iran. And the world suddenly looks a much more dangerous place. I cannot imagine a worse alliance than these three powers. One power, America, is the only power in the world to have used atomic weapons. Israel has a secret illegal nuclear program which it denied for years, but we know it exists. It's the only nuclear power in the Middle East. And Britain, of course, the former colonial power, provided them the means to get those nuclear weapons all those years ago. These are the powers which have blood in their hand. Israel, of course, in Palestine and in Lebanon, but Britain and America. Britain and America's involvement in Iran goes way back to 1953 when they combined to overthrow a democratic government. And this is still remembered. A radical government under Mossadegh, which had nationalized the oil industry, was overthrown by an MI5 CIA coup which installed the Shah of Iran. And I think people in London and Washington have short memories about this.
But there's always been that perceived threat from Iran. After all, that's the argument behind the anti-missile defense system currently being proposed for Europe. So surely there is some threat here, and it's a credible threat.
Well, Britain and America seem to redefine what threats are. I mean, for instance, we had, for all those years of the Cold War, the threat was Russia. NATO is now realigning itself, building a missile shield, which seems to be aimed at Russia in part, but also definitely against Iran, with setting up in Turkey. And we've seen NATO intervening into the region all around Iran, China's and Russia's borders. It seems to be provocative that you have this string of NATO-American bases along in the Caucasus and elsewhere, threatening the interest of these countries. And of course, we've also seen NATO launch a series of operations, most importantly in Afghanistan, but most recently in Libya. I am fearful that the so-called success of the Libyan operation will be followed by further humanitarian wars, like we saw in former Yugoslavia over a decade ago. And NATO is playing an aggressive role here. It's portrayed as a peacekeeper, but it's an aggressive role. And the missile defense shield is an aggressive act. It's aggressive towards Russia, it's aggressive towards China, and it's aggressive towards Iran.
But why isn't Iran being transparent and open and allowing investigators and inspectors to check the facilities? And also, of course, you mentioned Israel, the threat from Israel a little earlier. Iran's got every reason, has it not, to develop a nuclear deterrent?
Well, firstly, Iran claims that it's developing a nuclear program for peaceful purposes. Personally, I'm against all nuclear weapons, but I think it's a bit rich to be Iran to be lectured by the likes of Washington, London and Tel Aviv on nuclear weapons, when these are the people, as I said, the Americans are the only people to have used those weapons. These are the nuclear powers. And the hypocrisy it seems to be here is that these countries, the Western countries, can have weapons which can destroy the world many, many more times over, but no one else has the right to develop this technology. Now, I would rather us have no nuclear weapons, but I put the blame first and foremost on America, Britain and Israel here. And really, as I say, people in the region must have long memories, not just of the intervention in Iraq, and there was a contingency plan which Donald Rumsfeld literally took off the shelf within hours of 9/11 to present to George Bush for an attack in Iraq, but they must remember Britain and Israel's involvement in the Suez invasion of 1956. They must remember that Britain and America put the Shah in power. They must remember Britain's involvement in that region all those decades ago.
All right, we're getting a lot of rhetoric from the West, and of course, if a strike were to take place, what would that do for President Ahmadinejad? Clearly, he would be absolutely entitled for some sort of recrimination. What does that do for also his support there in Iran?
Well, first, I think people in the West seem to underestimate the strength of Iranian nationalism. There may be differences in house in Iran. However, there is a strong nationalist sense and a remembrance of what happened of foreign intervention into the country and how the Shah was installed and maintained by Britain and America inside. People have long memories of the Shah, and the way it's presented now in the West is if the Shah is a liberal regime. There will be a bloody war if there is an attack in Iran. Iran is not Iraq as of 2001. There will be retaliation from Hezbollah and from Hamas, and the world is a more dangerous place because of these reports.
Chris, just finally, you talk about a bloody war and the consequences after Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya, as well as, of course, talk of intervention in Syria. Is there really any appetite among the people, let alone the politicians, for further military interventions like that?
Well, it seems bizarre that you would have thought that anyone even thinking about contingency plans to Iran would look at that, and the opposition in this country, Britain for instance, to the war in Libya, there was a majority against that. But of course we're talking about economically declining powers in America and Britain, and their military assets remain. They remain the one thing they can deploy, and we know that Britain and America, more importantly America, are prepared to use their military power to try and buttress their economic position in the world in relation to China, in relation to economy. So I think what we're seeing here, we know this from history, economic instability often leads to military adventures, often leads to wars, and I think we must be worried at the moment. The one thing I would say is if I was an American president, I would be worried about thinking about any attack in Iran, given the level of opposition to his economic policies we're seeing on the streets of Oakland, the streets of Washington and New York and elsewhere with this Occupy movement.
And of course the forthcoming presidential elections in November, within a year from now, so interesting political gamble that would be. Chris, we could talk more, but thank you very much indeed for joining us. Chris Banbury, political analyst, joining us there in London. Thanks for your time.
New revelations are emerging about the anti-Islam Norwegian man who killed 76 people in a bomb and gun attack last week. Andres Behren Breivik has reportedly emailed leaders of right-wing extremists in Britain just an hour before carrying out the massacre in the capital, Oslo, and a nearby island. In the email, he told the British National and English Defence League that Europe would be, quote, overwhelmed by Islam. The terrorist called the participants, or rather the recipients of his email, Western European patriots, and urged them to forward the message to everyone they knew. Breivik is now in custody awaiting trial. Under Norwegian law, he'll be sentenced to a maximum of 21 years in jail. That is if convicted.
In the early 1960s, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Ella Lemonser, concocted a plan for false flag operations as a pretext to invade Cuba and for war with the Soviet Union. In Operation Northwoods, they planned to hijack jets by remote control, crash them, and blame the attack on Cuba. There were many other terrorist attacks they planned to carry out that were contained within the document.
It will also tend to show a trend towards being anti-Islamic. But in this case, I think this is a diversionary tactic There's no question at all that this man was a very devout Christian Zionist with strong links to Israel, and he'd visited there several times. And I think also that he was a Freemason, which puts him in line with what we call the New World Order. So there's a very strong Zionist lead there, and these are fragmented groups. They're quite small. Even if there is a connection in the UK, they would be under great pressure to allow this to come out, because many times they try and break up these groups. The government try and close them down. So this would be very sensitive for them. They may support it, but they wouldn't declare it openly.
Right, UK media reports show the Norwegian terrorist was in contact with British extremist groups. Why do you think the British government has chosen not to deal with these groups?
For the reason I've just said, it's a very sensitive area, and I would not think for 1 minute that there's 100% concrete evidence that that is true. This could be, as I say, a diversionary tactic to take the focus away. At the end of the day, this is showing a clear sign that it could be a false flag. There's so many incidents that took place prior to this event and during the event that really do not make sense. And we see this many times in other false flags. I'm not saying 100% it was a false flag, but it's certainly showing a sign of being an inside job with Zionist interference.
Middle East consultant in London, Peter Eyre, thank you.
With the collapse of the oil embargo to force Iran into a confrontation over the Straits of Hormuz, the US and Israel are looking for another way to get the long-sought war with Iran started, and more to the point, need to make it look like Iran is starting hostilities in order to make it politically and more difficult for Russia and China to support Iran. Now, recall that Israel has a past history of attacking US warships and framing others to trick the US into attacks on Israel's enemies, with the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty, initially blamed on Egypt, as the most well-known example. So here we have the USS Enterprise, the oldest carrier in the fleet, on her last legs, scheduled to be decommissioned next year. Her name is well known in part because of the Star Trek TV series. Decommissioning a nuclear aircraft carrier is a very expensive process. USS Enterprise is powered by 8 nuclear reactors, all of which must be disposed of as nuclear waste material along with all the associated machinery. The US Navy would save a great deal of money, more than the scrap worth of the steel, if USS Enterprise were to be sunk in the Persian Gulf, where the radioactive mess is someone else's problem to deal with. So why send an ancient warship at the end of a useful life into harm's way? The same reason Franklin Roosevelt moved a bunch of obsolete warships from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, while their newer carriers and warships were well away from Hawaii on December the 7th, 1941. Israel has 3 Dolphin submarines, given to her by Germany. They have been seen transiting the Suez Canal in the past and could well be operating in the Gulf of Oman, even the Persian Gulf by now, lying in wait for a used-up and obsolete warship, more useful as a sacrificial lamb than an actual weapon, a ship with American sailors to be attacked as Israel attacked the USS Liberty, then to be blamed on the designated target, Iran, by a compliant media. If you agree with this analysis, please post this video everywhere you see this carrier story. If we can make them doubt a false flag will be believed, maybe they'll call it off.
One scenario mentioned was the destruction of a U.S. naval vessel that was to be blamed on a foreign power as a pretext for war with any enemy they picked. President Lyndon Baines Johnson went operational with Northwoods on June 8, 1967 during the Six-Day War. During the Six-Day War between Israel and the Arab nations, the USS Liberty was sent by Johnson to collect electronic intelligence in the eastern Mediterranean. The clearly marked U.S. intelligence ship was 14 miles off the coast of Israel in international waters.
A short time after the air attack had been completed, the 3 torpedo boats approached us from our starboard quarter at high speed and in an apparent torpedo launch attitude.
Israeli surveillance aircraft flew low over the ship and clearly identified it as an American vessel. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, the USS Liberty was attacked by 3 Mirage 3 fighter bombers. From the onset of the attack, the fighter bombers were jamming U.S. signals. Not only were they jamming U.S. signals specifically, they were also unmarked, the only unmarked aircraft in Israel's arsenal. The fighter bombers strafed the ships with their cannons, dropped conventional munitions and napalm on the ship, repeatedly from stem to stern. After the Mirages had done their work, the ship was hit by medium bomber Dassault missiles carrying napalm and other munitions like white phosphorus. The USS Liberty was then attacked by 3 Israeli torpedo boats bearing Israeli flags. The torpedo gunboats opened fire with high-caliber machine guns and launched torpedoes. A single torpedo struck the ship, blowing a hole in both sides, entering the ship and leaving a 30-foot exit hole when it exploded. Then the torpedo boats began strafing life rafts in the water, an international war term. While all of this was happening, the oversized American flag flew clearly above the ship. The attack on the Liberty went on for hour after hour after hour. During the entire attack, the USS Liberty continually called the 6th Fleet that was nearby, begging for air support or rescue. 2 aircraft carriers in the Med responded by launching fighter aircraft. Unbelievably, they were recalled by the White House. Rear Admiral Geist, then commanding the carriers in the 6th Fleet, called Washington personally to confirm the recall order. Secretary of Defense McNamara came on the line, and then President Johnson himself told Geist, "I want that goddamn ship going to the bottom. No help. Recall the wings." Imagine being Admiral Geist begging the president to allow you to defend an American ship that's under attack and being told by him that he wants the ship going to the bottom. Despite the fact that the U.S. carriers withdrew their help, a Russian spy ship appeared and witnessed part of the attack. After 3 hours into the attack, the Israelis withdrew because there were witnesses, allowing the damaged USS Liberty to limp to safety. 40 years after the attack on the USS Liberty, we know exactly what happened. I've interviewed former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Thomas Moorer. I've interviewed the admirals that were on the line who heard what President Johnson said. I've even talked to the head JAG officer of the Navy who was ordered to falsify the reports and cover up what had really happened. One of the Israeli pilots has gone public as well, saying that 3 times he refused over his radio to headquarters to attack the ship, saying clearly that it was an American ship in international waters and an ally. He was ordered under threat of court-martial to engage the ship. In a nutshell, this is what happened. President Johnson had personal control over the ship, parked it in the Mediterranean, made a backroom deal with Israel to attack it with an order to kill all aboard. Then the attack on the ship was to be blamed on Egypt. The U.S. would enter the war and take over the entire Middle East in the aftermath of the attack on the most highly decorated ship in U.S. history. The captain and his entire crew were told they would spend life in prison or be killed if they told anyone what happened. Captain William L. McGonigal was given the Congressional Medal of Honor in secret and told not to tell anyone that he had won the...
Is this real life or some Bay of Pigs pre-election year hallucination? People, the US and Israel are in a panic. Occupy America is growing and the corporate media are unable to get a handle with which to ridicule and dismiss it. In desperation, the plan is to launch a major war with Iran, which will mean war with Russia, then use that resulting world war to demand the American people forget all about Wall Street's mortgage-backed security fraud, all about the ruined economy, all about the other wars, all about the lies, salute the flag and throw your money and our children into the bayonets of Israel's enemies on command. Because that's what worked the last 2 times. And the only people who can stop this are you. I need all of you to drop what you're doing and call your local TV station, your local newspapers, your Congress critters, and tell them in no uncertain terms that you know this Iranian plot is total bullshit, and you refuse to fight any more wars to save Israel or to save Wall Street. Then call all your friends and family and ask them to do the same. Do it now. Tomorrow may be too late. To delay is to lose. If we do not choose to fight against these money junkies now, we will soon have no choice but to fight for the money junkies from now on. If they get this war they want launched, None of us will ever live to see a time of peace again. Is that the world you want to leave to your children? Get angry, make noise, be heard, be seen, be a member of the human race. Do the right thing.